Yes, I'm Rachel Oldroyd. I'm from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. Hurrah, it's working. So why should science writers care about investigative journalism? It's quite an interesting subject to follow the last one, where everyone was talking about money and how much you get paid for a number of words. Obviously, in investigative journalism, the most important thing is time, and people rarely pay for people's time these days. So in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to sort of urge you to do more investigative journalism. I don't have a solution as to how you're going to get paid really well for doing that. But if you just keep saying this stuff is important, and it's really important we ask these questions, hopefully editors will start listening and start publishing. And I know we've got a great piece that's going to be talked about after me, where presumably there was editor buy-in and a realisation that this stuff is important. So just to get us started, because I know we're about an hour away from lunch and it's been a very hard morning, no doubt. So I'm going to ask a rather silly question, but just try and get a bit of engagement. So can you just put your hands up if you became a journalist because you entered the profession for the money? Okay, great. What about glamour? Anyone enter this profession for the glamour? Oh, hurrah! One. Maybe in the wrong room. Maybe you should be in the room of fashion journalists. How about because you were a curious person who wanted to make a difference? Great, right answer. Obviously, there's other answers too, but well, that's exactly why I became a journalist, and it's exactly why I went to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in 2010 when it was launched. Hopefully, most of you will have heard of the Bureau. We don't do masses of science reporting, so it may not be on your radar. If it's not, look us up. We are a not-for-profit investigative journalism organisation. We do deep dive, long-term investigations into matters of public interest, into stories that really matter. So just an example of 3 stories we've run recently. A couple of weeks ago, we did a piece of reporting on a really important, not talked about story where people in Yemen are literally being disappeared by an elite force run by UAE who are working closely with the US, and there's big questions about whether this represents a return of rendition and interrogation, all these things that the CIA was accused of 2 years ago. We did a lot of reporting around the election, and this wasn't the type of reporting that Politico did, where if it's old, where if it was news 2 hours ago, it's old news. Most of our stories in our election reporting took us 6 weeks, and that was a really quick turnaround for us. So this one, we built a massive, very complex database to try and work out patterns of voting and how people would vote. You know, the pollsters have got it wrong so many times. They got it wrong yet again. By looking at ways that people voted in the past, and in particular sets and groups of people. So we looked at newly registered voters, and we looked at people who voted UKIP and Green in the last election, in constituencies where they no longer had candidates standing for those parties. And we identified 20 constituencies that were considered really safe Tory seats, and our analysis suggested that they would swing, and sure enough, most of them did swing. And then an area that we do, which is in the science area, is looking at antibiotic resistance. We have 2 staff reporters looking at this area. We've been covering it for 18 months. A recent story we did in collaboration with a German broadcaster was looking at pharmaceutical companies out in India, where most of our antibiotics are made. We did lots of testing of water sources around the factories in Hyderabad, where a lot of this stuff is produced. And sure enough, we found an awful lot of resistant bugs in the water sources. I mean, really, really, really high levels in some cases. So that's some of the stories that we did. And just to give you a sense of time, and as we were talking about pay and you know, how to get money for this stuff, the UAE story took our Middle East specialist reporter about 3 months working with a Yemeni, an Arabic translator. She worked for us for about 3 weeks. Our voter power was a new team we've got called Bureau Local, which is all about data that tells stories at a local level. They are a team of 4. They worked with 2 political science statisticians over a period of about 4 weeks. And the big pharma pollution story took about 3 or 4 months. So that's the sort of level of work that we put into. So let's just take a step back. Why do we need an organisation like the Bureau? It essentially all comes down to money. These are well-rehearsed arguments. I'm sure you're all aware of them, but let's just put them up there so we remind ourselves. There is a funding crisis in the media. It's been going on for 10 years. It's not getting better. In fact, in the past 18 months, it's got really quite critical. A recent report at the beginning of this year suggested that 85 cents of every dollar of online advertising now ends up with Google and Facebook. That was money that used to pay our salaries, guys. Money that used to go to the content creators. At the same time, and because of this funding crisis, newspapers in particular, online publishers too, have magazines as well, are now looking for content that gets clicks, that engages with readers. We've always wanted to produce content that engages and that readers like, but it's become an obsession. We've forgotten about the important stories. We now think about the stories that are important to the public, i.e. they want to read them. So we judge things by clicks. At the same time, where there is a stretch on resources, we've also moved into the 24/7 news cycle. This was well described by a representative from Politico. Our journalists in newsrooms are no longer producing 1, maybe 2 editions of a paper a day. They're having to produce stories on a minute-by-minute basis. They're reacting to breaking news online. They're trying to produce it for social. They're trying to produce it for their website. They're also trying to print a newspaper still. And it's the same issue in broadcasting. They're trying to put out reports for the 6 and the 10 and the 24-hour news channel, and at the same time produce reports online. So we've all been asked to do a lot more with fewer and fewer resources. Global events, my gosh, what a year it has been. The news flow has just been incredible. I would argue, it's felt like an exception, but I would argue that actually I don't think things are going to get better. We are now in a global world. We've all started waking up to the lack of barriers that exist. We've become obsessed with American stories. We're really interested in what went on in the French election. We will be interested in the German election. We want to read about the earthquake that happens in South America, or the landslide, or the terrible terrorist attack in Pakistan. We're really interested, and the global events are now need covering as well as our local and our national news. And finally, we've got the rise of fake news. And fake news is a problem because it's pulling away readers, but it's also a problem because it's another thing that is eroding confidence in the media. There are so many things at the moment that are encouraging the readers to distrust the media, and fake news is just the latest thing to hit us. So, about 10 years ago, when all of this first started to show its head in the global financial downturn, we all started wringing our hands about, oh my goodness, what are we going to do about investigative journalism? This really important cornerstone of our democracy. How are we going to pay for this stuff? Well, I'm very pleased to say that the industry has started to stand up to the challenge. We've got a bunch of new platforms like Vice News and BuzzFeed. And BuzzFeed is amazing. They're doing incredible stories across the board, not just by their investigative team. They've gone from lists of cats to really remarkable journalism. We've got investigation editors and investigation teams cropping up all over the place in newspapers and broadcasters. And then we've got these exciting new models like the Bureau. This is the not-for-profit funded sector where journalists have gone, we need to preserve this stuff. It's so important philanthropic funders, please help. Donors, members of the public, please help us do this stuff. It's a huge phenomenon in the US. There's about 150 not-for-profit, largely investigative or specialist journalistic organisations in the US. Some of them are starting to resemble traditional newsrooms. ProPublica, for example, if you don't know it, I urge you to look it up. They're doing some really great stuff. They've been on a roll in the past 12 months. They now have 85 journalists. The Centre for Investigative Reporting in California, they've went from 7 reporters to 70 reporters in 7 years. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, they were the guys that coordinated and managed the amazing Panama Papers revelations last year. And in the UK, we've got the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. And we're doing quite well too. We've doubled in size in the past 2 years. In the 7 years we've been around, we've grown from 1 funder to 10. We've become increasingly widely known within the news ecosystem, not just in the UK, we're now increasingly known in the US as well. We've produced some really high-impact international stories, some of which I highlighted earlier. And we're starting to launch new projects, quite resource-heavy projects, like our Bureau Local program. So things are not that bad. I mean, they could be better, they could be more, but they're not that bad. The problem is by highlighting investigative journalism, we've created a bit of a silo. David Lee, who I'm sure you all know, is investigations editor at The Guardian, said to me a few weeks ago, you know, we've just ended up with a bunch of people sat around in teams on a desk going, what do we investigate? What do we do? What's the story? And the problem is most of these people are generalists. So they tend to look at the big stories, you know, the counterterrorism, fake news, our National Health Service, political stories, science stories, stories that are going to be popular, stories that are going to grab the news agenda, the big issues. What we are now lacking, and what I'm increasingly becoming really worried about, is the lack of specialist reporters. People like you guys doing investigative journalism. You know, some of the stories that you come across or some of the things that you know about could provide really good investigations, but it's just increasingly not happening. And it's not in science, it's everywhere. You know, our newsrooms used to be filled with transport editors and union and labour specialists and health specialists and science editors. And you know, now we have just got rooms full of generalist reporters who can report on breaking news very quickly, which is a skill in itself. But we are losing the specialist knowledge, and we're losing engaged, questioning, curious specialist reporters. As I said, I don't know the solution. I mean, the solution is money, for sure, and I'm not sure where that's coming from. But, you know, it is important. If we don't start valuing this stuff, we will start losing really important stories. We will stop surfacing these stories. And I think science of all subjects is one of the ones. It's a bit like finance. You know, this is an area that only a specialist reporter can cover. It's really difficult for me. I might have amazing investigative skills, but I don't understand anything about science. I don't know the people to talk to. I'm unlikely to get the whistleblowers because I just don't know the right questions to ask. I don't have the context. So not only is it a really difficult subject to cover, but it's also an incredibly important subject. As I'm, you know, I don't need to tell you this. This is a subject that enters all parts of our life and covers all parts of our lives that is largely going unquestioned. And there are huge issues here. You know, only at the weekend I read a report by a bunch of academics at Cambridge who've just launched the Bullied into Bad Science campaign because they're claiming that they, like journalists, are having to sex up their stories to get engagement and even to get funding. You know, we should all be questioning this. All these reports that are coming out, are they being sexed up? Are the results really valid? To quote a controversial artist, Damien Hirst, science has become our new religion. And if we don't start looking at it and querying it and questioning it, then it will become godlike. So I challenge you all, as I say, I don't know the answer. I don't know how you're going to get paid to do this stuff. But I really challenge you all to really think about doing investigations. They don't have to take 6 months or a year. There are investigations that take much longer. I don't know how long these guys' the investigation took, but I'm sure they will tell you. There's small things, there's small questions. They do produce really good stories, and they produce really important stories, and this stuff really matters. So thank you. If you want to look us up, that's our website. We're on Twitter and Facebook. If you want to follow our antibiotics work, that's also got its own Twitter feed, TBIJ Antibiotics. Please share our stories. Please join our news lists. That all helps to support our organisation and helps us to do more. Thanks a lot.